All right, so last time we left off talking about these pollen cones that produce microsporangia, or sperm and pollen, and then seed cones that produce megasporangia, the eggs, the ovule structure. And in general, very general, it's about a 3-year process to go from cone to mature seed. So that is something I want you guys to remember. Put a little sticky note, little star. In some of the conifers, 3-year process for reproduction. While you're better than the seedless plants because you're using seeds, that's one of their big hangups is the length of time for reproduction. And that's something we'll talk about when we get into angiosperms, why the angiosperms are actually a bit more competitive because they can reproduce much quicker. So, okay, so let's take a look at the general cycle of how this would work. So let's start out, let me change this to, let's say it's spring of 21. Sometime early spring, depends on the plant, depends on the environment, but let's just say it's early spring of 21 and that cone develops on the pine tree. So the pollen cone. So this pollen cone will develop early spring and start producing pollen. Usually, it might be in May. And again, there's variation here, so don't hold me to, well, it's May and I don't see it. But generally in May, roughly in that May, early June window, you're going to see the pollen cone. And the pollen cone is going to produce the pollen or the sperm. And what we know about the pollen cone is that they are located on the lower branches of the pine tree, of the conifer. So you look at the lower branches and you see these little curly kind of cone structures. You're like, that looks kind of weird. That's pollen cone. The same time in the spring of 21, we will see the seed cone developing. So the seed cone is what's going to produce the seed or the ovule structure. But this is located on the upper branches. So the seed cones are always positioned higher. So now the challenge is getting this pollen to the egg. But the key here is positioning. So having the seed cone higher in the pine tree than the pollen cone is going to give you an evolutionary advantage. I want you guys to think about it. What would the benefit be to have your seeds above your pollen? You're not using an animal pollinator. So there's no insect, there's no animal that will carry the pollen from the pollen cone to the seed cone. It's completely wind driven. So again, what's the advantage here? It's obviously successful. It's worked for 300 million years. But again, I want you guys to think about this. Start problem solving this one. Nature figured out a way. So think about a pine or coniferous forest, not how we plant them in our backyards, but a natural pine forest. If you have the male cone down here, that's the male cone, and the female cone up here on each of these trees, that's male there, that's female there, and along comes a breeze, breeze blue, it's more likely to transfer your pollen to the neighbor. So there's your evolutionary advantage of this positioning, to have the female cone higher than the male cone. You decrease the chance of self-fertilization. You're increasing the likelihood of this is supposed to say cross pollination. You don't want to pollinate yourself. You want to blow your pollen. That's terrible, but that's supposed to say pollination. You want to blow your pollen to the neighbor, so you fertilize their eggs, and then their pollen gets blown onto you to fertilize your eggs. that gives you genetic diversity within your population. If you're fertilizing yourself all the time, that's boring, and you're not increasing genetic diversity. All right, so let's keep following this journey. Pollen cone, egg cone, both show up spring of 21. Now, pollination is usually a 7 to 10 day window in the spring. Small little window. After pollination, pollen cone falls off. So if you go out to your pine tree in the middle of June or July, there's all these little cones on the ground. Those are all pollen cones that fell off. So imagine how horrible that would be. You just pollinated and now your cones fall off. So hopefully the pollen has blown over to the egg, to the seed cone, and it sticks to the seed cone. And then it's going to hang out. And it's going to sit there. And what will happen is this thing called the pollen tube will grow towards the megaspore, the egg cell. That's the structure here. So here's your pollen, and pollen actually looks like Mickey Mouse. There's the two big ears. This is where the genetic material is housed, and then you have these two wings on the side of the pollen of the genetic material. So here it is. But then this structure called the pollen tube grows towards the megaspore or the egg. So that takes, in some cases, that takes a year for that to happen, just for that to grow. So then in the spring of 22 is when fertilization occurs. So you got your pollen there, but it took a full year to get the sperm to finally swim down to the egg, or to move down to the egg, to then possibly fertilize. So the female cone stays on the tree. Okay, spring of 22. All the male cones fell off last year. Fertilization hopefully took place in the early spring of 22. And then now the seed starts to develop. And the seeds can take months to years to fully develop. So fertilization happens spring of 22. It might be spring of 23 to have a mature seed. So now that seed's sitting in that mature cone. That's what we're looking at here, a mature cone. Spring of 23, got a mature seed, mature cone. And now, oh, that's not working. And then now, let me get a box. It might be summer, fall of 2023. The seeds are dispersed primarily by wind. And then spring 2024, potential germination to get your little pine seedling to grow up and start to develop your sporophyte here. These up here, gametophytes. So this is why in big picture in general, you got about a 3-year process for some of these. That's great if you're the only seed producer. But when it comes to competition, the quicker you can churn out offspring, the more likely you are to be successful. All right, so here's the overall picture of the pine life cycle, kind of the big picture of how all this works. You know, we can start with a seedling, takes years to mature to be a sporophyte. You then produce your pollen cone, your ovulate cone. That's the fancy word for egg cone. The ovule is where the egg is housed. The pollen has to get there. That is pollination. Then it takes time to eventually fertilize. You fertilize, you start to develop. That now turns into a mature seed. It gets the seed coat wrapped around it, and then it gets released out of the tree, and hopefully that life cycle continues. All right, so big picture with phylum Coniferophyta. All right, let's check out Cicadophyta, Cycads. Now, often these are mistaken for palm trees. You know, this is a cicad, cycad, however we want to say it, whatever accent or enunciation. But they look like miniature little pine trees. They are not. I'm sorry, they look like miniature palm trees. They are not. Palm trees have flowers. Cycads have cones. Evolutionarily, about 248 million years ago, so they're not as old as pines, but still a pretty old group. They use cones for reproduction. And the pollen is going to be dispersed by wind. So wind carried pollen just like with the pines. But here's a big difference between cycads and conifers. Cycads are what we call dioecious. Now, conifers are monoecious. Cycads are going to be dioecious. So what this means is you have two plants one is male and the other is female. Oh, let me get that out of the way. So monoecious, you have both male female structures on the same plant. Dioecious, you have boy plants, you have girl plants. And we can tell that by the cone they produce. So here's the cone. Officially, it's called the strobili. So this is the male cone that will produce microsporangia or microspores or pollen, sperm. These are the female cones. They almost look like ears of corn on the cob. Megaspores, they tend to be smaller, not nearly as colorful. One way to tell the difference between the male and the female cones. All right, but the point is you have two different plants, one male, one female. So when it comes to maintaining populations, you better have both male and female plants in your population, and a lot of them. If you're dealing with monoecious plants, it's easier to maintain the population because you don't need as many because everybody reproduces with everybody and everybody can have offspring. Where here, only half of your population can have offspring, provided they're females. But if you had 100 conifers, all 100 can reproduce offspring themselves because they have the female cones on them. Okay, so things to think about. What makes groups evolutionarily more successful than others? All these little strategies. Those things add up and make a difference. So, all right. Okay, so now let's check out Neophyta. Now, Neophyta, kind of weird. Almost like a bridge moving towards flowering plants. Out of all of the conifers, these guys have probably the most efficient vascular system. Their life cycle is pretty darn similar to flowering plants. So there's going to be some tweaks when we get to the flowering plants, but pretty similar. Some of them are monoecious, while others are dioecious. So that does create a little bit of a conundrum to go, wait, what? It's some plants in neophyte reproduce. Some of them are males and others are females. Some of them have both genders. Okay, so again, a little bit of a weirdness to this group. The one to mention, and I'm not going to ask you guys to know all these little details. This is conversational. This is stuff As you move on, you may need this in more detail. But the most widely recognized member of Neophyta that we generally would come across would be this one called ephedra. Ephedra has been used in a lot of different medical practices and medical situations. It's known to stimulate your brain, increase your heart rate, blood pressure, metabolism, bronchial tubes, etc. Sometimes we see athletes have used these supplements for performance enhancing drugs. People often have used them as weight loss supplements. Like, wow, if my metabolic rate gets revved up, whoo, I'll burn more calories without having to do anything. Don't mess with it. Not safe. It's not a good thing to be messing with. People actually died taking these things, green stingers. They took too many, heart rate went up, blood pressure went up, and basically stroked themselves out. These were high school age athletes who did this. So be very careful. I would definitely discourage you guys from messing with any of this. Okay, one more part, one more phylum to cover under the Gymnosperms, and then we'll have this group wrapped up.